Welcome to Redefining Plastics podcast. My name is Justin Wright. With me today, I have Joshua Baca. Joshua, thanks for joining us.
Justin, thank you so much for having me on today.
Why don't you tell me a little about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, happy to do so. My name is Joshua Baca. I have long had a career in government and public affairs for the last 20 years. I've worked in multiple capacities, I guess is the best way to say it. I've worked on Capitol Hill. I've worked in congressional and presidential politics. I've worked in trade associations and coalitions. And most recently, I was the head of the plastics division at the American Chemistry Council. Now I run my own company called Resilient Partners. We are a government and public affairs company located in the greater Washington, D.C. area. And we help our clients navigate strategic advocacy, strategic communications, and reputation management. And we try to help them find the intersection of those three to drive more favorable outcomes in the policy-making process.
Yeah, and I can speak from experience. You do great work.
You
work with me quite often, and we've been very active in the advocacy / legislative space, and appreciate all the efforts there.
You know, it's a pleasure working with you guys. You guys are a great company with great people, and so you guys make my job just a little bit easier.
We try to. I think the governments don't make it as easy as we would like with things like this. So today we wanted to pull you in because obviously you know the legislative space. You're very highly active in advocacy. And I wanted to talk about the UN Global Plastics Treaty. Not a lot of people are talking about this, and I think it's going to have a pretty major impact on plastic production globally if things turn out the way that they seem to be heading right now. So I want to talk a little bit to you about what exactly is the Global Plastics Treaty and how did that come about?
Yeah, you know, it might be one of the single most consequential issues facing the plastics industry today that the general public and most people probably don't know much about. And so the Global Plastics Treaty itself is an effort, it's still ongoing, to address plastic waste all around the world. It started off at the United Nations Environmental Assembly, where they passed a resolution formulating an intergovernmental committee, an intergovernmental negotiating committee, or an INC, to really negotiate a binding agreement to address plastic pollution in the environment. What has happened since that agreement passed several years ago is this treaty itself has taken sort of a new form here, and it's taken on a variety of issues. You know, the original goal really centered on addressing waste in the environment, particularly in the developing world. It's now taken on a full broad spectrum scope that impacts not just the packaging space in the plastics industry, but also the durable space. You're looking at things that address everything from plastic production caps to problematic plastics to additives used in the manufacturing of plastic production. And where we stand today is those negotiations are ongoing. There have been 5 INCs, or 5 intergovernmental negotiating committees, or 4, intergovernmental negotiating committee meetings, where these conversations have progressed at different paces here. We're now entering into the 5th INC, where they're trying to really put the finishing touches on this to have a binding agreement that countries could approve early next year.
Okay. So if the U.S. does not ratify once this negotiating process is complete, which is highly likely, right? We have a split government. The likelihood that you're going to get enough Republicans to vote in the Senate to approve any kind of plastics treaty is probably very low.
Yeah.
If that's the case, why does this matter?
Well, it matters for a variety of reasons. You know, first off, I think it matters in the context of global competitiveness. Whether or not the U.S. joins a binding agreement on plastic pollution that the INCs are negotiating is a good discussion to have. But if other countries agree to these binding measures, it could put the U.S. at a competitive advantage or disadvantage, depending upon the specifics of those provisions. The second reason it matters is, it starts setting precedent. Again, whether or not the U.S. joins that treaty or not, It began setting precedent on global production caps, potentially, list of problematic plastics, and a whole host of other items that maybe don't impact you in the government space, but could impact you in the market space and how your customers deal with that. I would say the third reason why this matters is really from a perception perspective. There is a waste challenge that exists in the world today. Many countries lack the necessary infrastructure to address not just plastic pollution, but all types of pollution. And the inability to address this is going to continue to make this issue one that is continuously debated in the global context of these negotiations. And so I think about my time when I was at ACC. I participated in several of these INC meetings, and I'm really drawn to this conversation that I had with one of the governments. I think it was Argentina, and their government negotiator said something to me to the effect of, hold up here. We understand all of the things that you want to address when it comes to circularity and a variety of other things, but our country lacks basic waste management infrastructure. And so the ability for us to think of an agreement that does that is really important. And so I think it goes back to those 3 points, which is it's going to set precedent, it's going to have an impact on your customers, and it's going to continue to be a massive perception problem without the appropriate waste management infrastructure to not just address plastic waste, but all types of plastic or all types of material.
So it seems like things are starting to shift a little bit in this process.
Yep.
I think we're seeing a bit of a move away from the original charter. So I've got the charter here in front of me, and I'm going to read it, at least parts of it. This thing reads like a bunch of kids got together and just started throwing platitudes together. So starting with noting with concern that the high and rapidly increasing levels of plastic pollution represent a serious environmental problem at a global scale, negatively impacting the environment, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development. Stressing the urgent need to strengthen the science policy interface at all levels, improve understanding of the global impact of plastic pollution on the environment, and promote effective and progressive action at the local, regional, global levels, recognizing the important role played by plastics in society. So that was a word salad.
Very much.
That's just a part of this charter. It goes from recognizing, noting, reaffirming. It literally reads like Mad Libs. So with what I just read, how do you feel like this process is going? Are we on track to meet the remit of this group?
I think today it's hard to say for certain if we're on track to meet the remit of what this charter says, but what I would say it is trending largely in the wrong direction for the plastics industry. I think it's really important when you have these discussions around plastics is you have to separate it into two contexts. There's the context of waste in the environment, and there's the context of what plastics does for society. I think everyone agrees that waste in the environment is bad, and we want solutions to address that. Those solutions need to include, as I mentioned, building waste infrastructure, meeting countries where they are with national action plans, and looking at a variety of ways to collect, sort, and process not just plastics, but particularly those difficult to recycle plastics. Think of things that are not a PET bottle or a high-density polyethylene jug, your films, your flexibles, your small formats, those types of things. You have to separate that discussion. I think that's a really important discussion where the charter itself seems to have deviated from that a little bit. Then there's a broader debate around plastic and the benefits it has to society. I think if you look at this from a science and a life cycle perspective, the charter and some of the negotiations are going off track, not based on science and not based on life cycle assessments. When you think about it from a life cycle assessment perspective, plastics has the lowest carbon footprint compared to any other material. It requires less water, less energy, and it's easier to manufacture from a variety of compared to a variety of other materials. And so when you purely look at it from a life cycle perspective, the UN is trying to address global climate change at a global level. Plastics are going to be needed to meet those global climate ambitions. They lightweight your vehicles. They keep your food fresh. They are the insulation in your home that makes it more energy efficient. They're the material that goes into new clean energy like windmills and solar panels. And so the material itself is fantastic and it does a variety of different things. But if these negotiations take the mold of we're going to just cap all production, then all of those benefits that society gets from them would really be put at risk. And so I think we have to focus on the latter part or the former part, which is how do we address the waste management issues that exist around the globe? I think the final point that I would make regarding the charter is when you think about it and what they're trying to accomplish is it's very much a top-down approach. And you just take the United States alone, the waste management systems in our country vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There's over 9,000 recycling jurisdictions alone in the United States. And so thinking that a solution that is going to be the equivalent for the United States and South Africa are going to be the same or not. They have very different systems. And so I think where the charter is also falling short here is it's not looking at it on those country by country basis. It's really looking at it from a top down approach, which could have, really adverse impacts for the plastics industry.
Yeah, I think you bring up several good points, but I want to focus on the science discussion for just a second. Why do we think we're in this place right now where science seems to be pushed to the side, where we're not really talking about the benefits of plastics, but we're more so talking about the end of life struggles? Where do you feel like we've gotten off track there?
Well, I think that when you look at it holistically from an industry perspective, I think industry itself has not traditionally done a good job talking about the science behind the manufacturing of plastics. I kind of think about it in a variety of buckets, which is, you have scientists and chemists and engineers who are thinking about these things on a daily basis and utilize science and engineering to make the best plastic products possible with the lowest environmental footprint possible. The industry hasn't always been very forthcoming in articulating that point to a variety of audiences. And so I think has happened here is you have a group of NGOs in particular, not all NGOs are created the same, but a group of some NGOs who have really sort of latched on to the science aspects of this and have, come forward and saying that plastics harms human health or plastics is a contaminant in the environment. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't do a variety of other things. And you've lost that narrative. And the reality of it is that to counter all of those points, plastics has been deemed safe for a variety of applications, whether it's from the Food and Drug Administration or the the European Health Commission. It's highly recyclable. Just not enough of it gets recycled today. And, some of the best science is used to manufacture these products today. And I think that story hasn't always been told, and there's been some reluctance to do so. And so, we take those buckets together. And when you look at what the number one attribute besides recyclability for plastics is a carbon footprint perspective. And we've sort of lost the narrative around that debate and have really allowed others to define what plastics are as opposed to the industry defining what plastics really are, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. I think from my perspective, it's become more of an emotional discussion rather than a strictly objective, how do we solve for decarbonization? Because I think you and I both agree that we have to look at these issues holistically. And I don't think that's really making it through. It's not cutting through in this discussion, which I think it's a real shame because we're making decisions collectively to move out of plastics into materials that are going to cause more long-term negative impacts, and people feel like they're making the right choice. And I think that's kind of where this whole UN Global Plastics Treaty has gotten off track because there's too many folks in there that kind of look at it from that perspective.
Look, this is a very emotional debate for some people. Yeah. You go back several years ago, I believe it was National Geographic with the picture of a turtle with a straw in its nose. That's what really opened the floodgates for the emotion behind this and the waste that has entered the environment. But when you think about it, I like to think of it as a three-legged stool of the things that plastics needs to do, which is it needs to solve for a climate issue, which it does. It needs to be designed to be recyclable, which many of them are, and it actually needs to be recycled. Two of those three stools are working really well right now. That third stool varies from country to country as to whether or not material actually gets recycled or can be recycled because of inadequate waste management systems, because of outdated technology, because of what I would say is a very 1980s way of looking at how we recycle material today. The world has evolved very significantly. There are new technologies coming to the market that can recycle more types of plastics. There are improvements being made to traditional recycling methods. Now you have things like AI and artificial intelligence and a whole lot of other things that come into play that make sorting those materials even better. That's great, and we need to do that. But again, I think we got to look at it from what the charter is saying too, is that approach might work well here in the United States. It's not going to work well in a developing nation where they don't even have a blue bin, much less a green bin to recycle the waste that they have right now. And so that's where I think the charter has gone off base a little bit, is it's still not focusing on the specific needs that are or that it was aimed to address when the original charter was put forth.
Could not agree more. So let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about negotiating positions.
Yeah.
There seems to be two competing groups out there. There's the high ambition and then the like-minded coalition. Can you
Yeah.
explain to the layperson what each of those groups are and kind of where they stand today?
Yeah. The High Ambition Coalition is largely led by the European Union and European nations. And they have taken and organized around an approach that largely calls for caps on production, listing problematic plastics to ban, and listing additives or chemicals that go into plastic production to ban as well too. That's their negotiating position, and that's what they've been advocating for. Whether or not you agree with their position, I think where they have done a very effective job is they have organized well, they have communicated their message very effectively, and they have added a degree of emotion to it that other countries have not done. And so that's one camp that's happening today. There's a second camp, as you mentioned, which is the like-minded coalition or the like-minded countries. That's made up of largely countries like the Gulf states and China and Russia. The United States was leaning in that direction up until recently, but they advocate for a much different approach, and naturally so because of the abundance of natural resources that these countries have that go into the manufacturing of plastics. And so they are looking at this from a totally different perspective, which is how do you address some of the waste management challenges? How do you take the societal benefits of plastic without limiting or eliminating certain types of plastics? And how do we look at this from a more holistic life cycle assessment perspective? Those are largely where the two camps have been. They could not be further apart from each other in the negotiating perspective. There's really no wiggle room or no middle ground between these two positions. What has changed over the last couple of weeks is the United States was really playing that middleman between both coalitions. They had been very much in favor of things like national action plans and EPR and a variety of other things that could be driven on a country by country basis that aligned a little bit more closely with the like-minded countries. I think they were sympathetic to the High Ambition Coalition that there needed to be, things addressed, whether that was, dealing with things that were or deemed problematic from a recyclability perspective, and a host of other issues there. What has happened is the United States has actually shifted further to the High Ambition Coalition. And, it seems like the official government position from the U.S. now is they do very much favor production caps, listing of problematic plastics, I put that in air quotes, and chemicals and additives that go into the manufacturing of plastics. That's a pretty significant shift. And when you look at it from a domestic political perspective, that really goes against everything the current administration is advocating for when it comes to clean energy, domestic manufacturing, and a whole host of other things. The outcome of such a position, really is just going to be outsourcing plastic production to the countries in that like-minded coalition that are never going to sign on to an agreement that limits the caps on production of plastic or does a variety of other things. And so that's where largely the camps are today. As I mentioned, they couldn't be further apart from each other and have differing views. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the next several weeks play out with negotiations happening in Busan in South Korea, and whether or not there's any room for a middle ground here.
All right. So we talked a little bit about the current focus there. Production caps. What exactly does a production cap look like? How does that impact the market? Can you explain just a little bit about what that truly means?
I think people are still a little bit uncertain on how a production cap would actually be implemented. But in a very general sense, is at some point in this process, there would be a benchmark year that was set in place. So let's say 2020, and you could not produce more plastic based upon that year, that benchmark year, and it would decrease over a variety of time, or the number would increase over a variety of time periods to limit plastic production. That's generally how people have articulated. I did read this week that there's another thing where some are advocating for something that would be like a cap and trade system where you trade credits and do a variety of things. That seems very bureaucratic and cumbersome to me to make that a reality. But in a general sense, that's what it does. It essentially is what it says. It would cap the production and the manufacturing, and probably more importantly to say the manufacturing of plastics that go into a variety of other products today.
So, what about polymer elimination lists or any other lists?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
I think that's another thing where the details haven't, really been fleshed out. But in a general sense, they're looking at developing a list of polymers or plastics that they deem unrecyclable today or problematic to the recycling system. And they have ranged from everything from specific types of formats to whole classes of resin like polystyrene and PVC, which would be extremely problematic for a variety of reasons that I've already mentioned. Some have articulated or argued for some type of decision tree where the decision tree would be dealt with on a country by country basis and local circumstances would deal with that. Now, where the details need to come in is does that country by country basis result in bans or does it result in innovation? Meaning that you're helping those companies think of ways to make those products that are deemed unrecyclable, recyclable by a date certain. That would be the optimal approach to take. To do that, though, there's a whole host of other issues that need to come into place, like how an issue like advanced recycling is recognized in this context, or chemical recycling, as others refer to it, which is, you can recycle a lot of products today via traditional mechanical methods, but some of those products that are deemed unrecyclable today could be recycled utilizing a variety of other advanced recycling technologies, whether that's pyrolysis, dissolution, methanolysis, so forth and so on. There are a host of technologies that make up that suite of advanced recycling systems. So I think those are the things and the issues that are still to be determined. And if you're a stakeholder in this process, you probably have a significant amount of anxiety because those details really are going to matter. They're going to impact your business operations. They're going to impact your public perception in the marketplace. And they're going to leave a taste in the mouth of your customers as to whether or not they could utilize your material or not. And whether or not that becomes binding or not, as I mentioned earlier, the precedent will be set.
So I think all of that, I could not agree more. There are no problematic plastics. Plastics are developed for specific end uses and they are engineered for those end uses. There's a reason why we have so many different polymers because it does the best job for whatever application it's being tasked to do. So you and I have done a lot of work on this where we're trying to improve the recycling access and rates for polystyrene, for example. And polystyrene is going to be front and center on any kind of elimination list, as it always is. And it could not be further from the truth. We are not a problematic plastic. We are a very essential, safe, recyclable, and low carbon solution. And we need 100%. To make sure that our messages are getting out there. That's a bit of an aside.
Yeah.
But wanted to.
But it's an important aside, right? In this context, because one way to look at it is you could look at the context of polystyrene, and some systems can recycle that today and some can't. And so what a lot of people have done is because some can and some can't is they've thrown up their hands in the air and they said this is all problematic. Well, not really, right? I mean, it does if you want to look at it from a 1980s, mindset perspective that only certain types of of technologies and only certain types of processes and only certain types of plastics can be recycled today. I think your point that everything is engineered with a purpose is really critical here. All we're trying to do now is catch up with the recyclability aspect of this and make sure that more of that recyclable polystyrene gets recycled. And the data, the science, and the engineering shows that you can do that. What this treaty could do, if I were taking a pen and writing it myself, is it would provide the conditions for materials like yours to succeed in this kind of environment.
Could not agree
And
more.
it's not doing that today, right?
Yeah.
That's where the missed opportunity, I think, really comes into play here.
Yeah. A lot of rear view mirror thinking rather than looking through the windshield. I think there's misconceptions and good intentions are making their way into legislation, not just at the UN, in the US, in certain states as well.
Yeah.
I think the difficulty that we have is how do we express the positives that come with our products without seeming like that we're just trying to brush these end of life true issues under the rug. I don't think anybody's trying to do that. I think we're very open to the fact that we need better solutions and we want to be a part of that process.
Yeah,
We
100%.
want to help solve end of life issues for plastics. And the UN Global Treaty could have done that. And so far, we are way off track. And I guess I'm not exactly surprised. We'll just put it that way.
I mean, to that point, when I was at ACC, I had two guiding principles that I used to preach to our members all the time and trying to look at this a little bit more holistically. One, to stop bad legislation, you got to be for things. You got to articulate a positive forward-looking vision around what you're for and how you're going to get there. And the second thing you need to do is you got to show progress on any commitments you make. You get a lot of credit for showing progress. You get slammed in the face for showing no progress. That could be everything from bringing products to the market that are made out of recyclable materials, to using less material, to even showing the life cycle assessment of materials compared to other, or plastics compared to other materials. So you've got to do those two things. And in this context of the global treaty or some of the state legislation that you mentioned, that to me are still the guiding principles for the industry that they need to follow.
Could not agree more with that. So we talked a lot about the fact that we're off base, we're off target here with this UN treaty. We've also talked about the fact that it doesn't seem likely that the US is going to join. What do we think of what's the fallout here? What are the actual impacts from this process, assuming that they're actually going to complete this thing by the end of the year, like they originally intended with this INC 5? What do you think is going to happen with all of this?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at what those U.S. impacts are. First off, I would say from a U.S. impact perspective, you're missing an opportunity here to sort of lead the world towards a vision that makes, markets and geographical areas circularity hubs of the world. North America itself could be the circularity hub of the world. We have the best feedstock, we have the best talent, we have the best technology, we have the best systems, and we have the best resources to do so. That could be a shining example that the U.S. does in rallying their neighbors to do something similar. Now, the second thing is the impact of that is that they've gone in this other direction, which is much more towards production caps and a lot of other things. If you want to increase domestic manufacturing, and we're having a presidential debate nationally today, that's happening with an election in less than a week, where a centerpiece of that discussion is how to increase domestic manufacturing. If ultimately an agreement is joined where there are production caps and some countries join and other countries don't join, and even whether or not the U.S. does or doesn't join, the problem is going to be is that we are basically going to be outsourcing our manufacturing to countries with lesser environmental standards. And the outcome and the practical impact of that could be importing raw material from places like China or importing more finished products from places like China, which really go to the antithesis of what the domestic manufacturing goals are today. I think the third impact here is going to be politically what happens in the United States. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs that are created by the plastics industry, and you think about all the indirect jobs that come from that as well too. There's huge investments in facilities all across the Gulf Coast, in Texas and Pennsylvania and Illinois and a whole host of other places. There's been billions of dollars already invested in commercializing new recycling technologies as well. All of those would be put at risk. And for what? To, you know, align with the High Ambition Coalition when your country may not ever be able to join that because of the political dynamics, as you mentioned earlier on. That seems very short-sighted to me from my perspective.
Yeah. It seems like there are some very, I don't want to make this too political, but it seems like there's some very progressive folks within the administration that are looking to push through some very strong environmental laws before the election. And I kind of feel like that's where we're getting caught up in this whole process, where the CEQ, so the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House, seems to be driving this discussion for the U.S. negotiating position. And it seems like they are trying to push through some very heavy-handed environmental laws, which in reality are going to do the exact opposite, to your point, of what they want to do. What they want to do is they want to decarbonize. Okay, why are we removing the least impactful option from the equation if you want to decarbonize? They want domestic manufacturing. Okay, why are we capping a very strong economic position for plastic production in the U.S.? Makes no sense at all. And I can go on and on and on. I don't think anybody wants to hear me ramble on this discussion for too much longer.
You raise a really good point, though, which is at one point, the negotiators were handling the discussion at the State Department, and they understood the importance of negotiating an agreement that the United States could join, which was, that word could is very important. Now it's become largely led by CEQ, as you mentioned, and it seems like it's much more about making a political statement and taking it to the industry as opposed to trying to do something where we set the shining example. I think that's pretty unfortunate at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it doesn't solve the waste problem.
It doesn't solve the problem. Yeah,
this thing does not solve the waste problem in its current iteration. And all it does is kick the can down the road when we could have really focused on infrastructure and helping those countries like Argentina that you mentioned earlier to actually build out a waste management system, which is the whole point of this. And we're so lost at this point.
To manage to better manage unmanaged waste, you need waste systems. You need waste and recycling systems. That's the genesis of what this should be focused in on. And it should be dealing with that on a country by country basis that deals with their local circumstances, that develop a national action plan, that does have global binding goals to get to achieve date certain specific objectives. But that, again, that discussion is not happening at a intellectual or political level, which, again, we'll go back to this point. It's just a lost opportunity to address what many people are eager to address today.
Yeah. So what do we do? I guess that's the big question with this whole thing. Is it's supposed to be done by the end of the year. It seems like industry's been largely cut out from the intercessional process, which is the negotiation between the negotiation.
Yeah.
And it looks like we're kind of being cut out of the INC5 process as well, with a very limited amount of attendees from the industry there.
Yeah.
So how do we get involved? Like how do we influence this process now, or is it too late?
It's never too late in my mind. I still think that there's a lot to determine at INC5. And, while there seems to be some broad agreements among the High Ambition Coalition and a host of other countries on some of these more negative issues, I would say it's far from certain that that's going to be the case of what's going to happen. So I think the things that you need to do, whether or not you can be a participant in INC5 is a good question, but the things you need to do is we still have a domestic challenge here, and we need to weigh in with your members of Congress and your senators, particularly where you have manufacturing facilities and investments and jobs, and let them know what what an agreement that caps plastic production and limits or creates lists and limits certain types of plastic would mean for those states and those districts. There's a political argument to be made here that is really critical. And having those senators in particular weigh in with the White House that such an agreement would never be ratified by the U.S. Senate, I think is really important. I think the second thing you need to do is you have to be aggressive in telling your story. I think you're doing a great job, Justin, in doing that on LinkedIn and with this podcast and a variety of other things. You have to continue to repeat the arguments. I come from the political background when I think about my communication style and a variety of other things that have influenced my career. And when you're thinking about it in that context, you got to tell something to someone 50, 60, 70, 80 times for it to resonate. And that's why when you're running a campaign like we're seeing here in the United States, you keep seeing those ads on TV over and over and over again. You may hate them, but science and the data shows that the political science and the data shows it works, because the more people see them, the more likely they are to gravitate towards some of those arguments, and you're able to educate them. Now, we're not running a presidential campaign with billions of dollars of political advertising, but you have to talk and target your message to those relevant stakeholders and continue to talk about what you're doing to those guiding principles, what you're for, and what progress you're making. I think that's really important. And the third thing I think you need to do is you need to develop more partnerships. I think you guys are doing a great job with the Polystyrene Recycling Alliance, which is going to get launched next year. But you need more of those partnerships, more of those public-private partnerships that show industry and government can work together to solve big problems. I think that's really important. Now, those take time, and maybe you don't have enough time before INC 5 to do something like that. But those are the types of things that are going to be needed, whether or not this is something the U.S. joins after this INC 5 and into the final stages of this negotiation process.
Yeah, and appreciate the plugs there. And it does sometimes feel like I'm fighting a lonely battle. There's one other person on LinkedIn that seems to be fighting the same battles as me, and we seem to be very lonely. So if I could advocate to anything for anybody that's listening to this, if you love plastics, get involved. Like Joshua says, talk about this, make noise.
Yeah.
And we have to tell our story better than what we're doing right now. And otherwise, this is going to continue until we get to the point where everything is a different material and plastics no longer is part of packaging, or at some point possibly even removed from the ecosystem altogether, which would be really bad for multiple reasons. We talked about lightweighting cars. We talked about energy efficiency in homes, and all of these things are very important. And we just do such a bad job as an industry talking about these things. We don't talk about the benefits well enough at all. And it's very frustrating to me, because you and I both see the benefits of these products, and we want to continue to espouse these benefits, but it seems like nobody's listening, or at least it's not cutting through.
Now that I'm a step away from the industry, I still think about these issues a lot. And, for people out there who are listening who maybe think plastics is bad, think about this from a manufacturing perspective. Think about this from a job perspective. As you just mentioned, if you want more electric vehicles, plastics are what lightweight those vehicles. Those need to be manufactured in the United States. If you want your homes to be more energy efficient with modern insulation, plastics is the material that makes that a reality. If you want, clean, renewable energy that is domestically produced, whether that's solar panels or wind turbines, plastics is going to be the domestic manufacturing material of choice to make that a reality. And so there may be a lot of people listening to this to this podcast who say, I've seen that picture with a turtle and a straw in its nose, and I hate plastic. Understand and empathize with those people. But we also need to make an argument about what some of the other consequences are, because it's much bigger than that as well, too. We could have both of the best of both worlds if we manage this process appropriately.
So if you were handicapping this process today, where do you think this is going to end up? What's the outcome here?
It seems to me like this will largely be something like the Paris Climate Accord agreement, where you have some countries who join the agreement and you have other countries who don't join the agreement. And, there's left with an unlevel playing field around how you're ultimately going to mitigate plastic waste from entering the environment. That to me seems like a very likely outcome here. And for the United States in particular, excuse me, they could be one of the outside parties looking in. And so that's really unfortunate from a variety of perspectives as well too. But that would to me seem like a likely outcome here. Maybe a second likely outcome is you have some type of agreement that sets goals and objectives around production caps and limiting plastics and whatnot, but perhaps those provisions aren't binding because countries can't ratify them. But they're more set as having goals and objectives as opposed to being binding in nature. I think that could be a second outcome here as well too.
Yeah, there seems to be a push within the current administration to look at this more as an aspirational treaty, very similar to the Paris Accords, in order to get it approved without having to go through Senate ratification. I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think that's going to happen. Because at this point, it seems like too many Republican senators are aware of this process and disagree with it. And so I find that hard to believe. But do you think that's a possibility in any way, shape, or form?
It's difficult today to get 51 votes in the Senate on almost anything. Anything. And so the idea that you would get 67 votes to ratify this seems like a really high bar in my perspective to overcome. But I've been proven wrong before, and maybe something changes that makes that more possible. But I just see that as a really high bar to overcome.
Yeah, I agree. It's court of public opinion. That's where this whole thing is won and lost. And right now we're losing, but hopefully we can start to turn around this conversation, the narrative, and start driving in a positive direction.
But there's one other thing to that that's I think really important to keep in mind here. There may not be 67 votes in the Senate to ratify an agreement, but there could be 51 votes for something like break free from plastics, and how the rules around that debate could happen. And so you could still implement plastic production caps or try to advance those based upon the political makeup of Congress after this election cycle. And so there are other ways, I think, to do this that could be equally problematic. Now, I guess technically you need 60 votes in the Senate to move legislation like that, which is still a high bar. But that could be the baseline. The Break Free from Plastics Pollution Act could become the baseline of where any future federal legislation is negotiated from.
Yeah, that's a whole other.
That's a whole other podcast.
That's
for you
a
to
Pandora's
do.
box. That is
a Pandora's box for you.
Yeah, that is to say that that the two of us are not in favor of that legislation would be an understatement. I believe. Yeah, I'll speak for you.
Yeah, 100%.
I was going to do a fun section at this point, but we've already talked 45 minutes, and I'm pretty sure I can only keep people's attention on plastics for about that long. So I wanted to give you a quick second at the end of this to kind of talk about what you're doing. You've got a podcast I've been listening to. If you wanted to give a quick shout out to some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for having me on, Justin. I've enjoyed the conversation. I love having these intellectual conversations around some of these issues because sometimes I think they don't happen enough. So I very much appreciate the opportunity. I would make a plug for my podcast called the Resilient Insights Podcast. You can get that podcast on YouTube or any of your streaming platforms today. We cover a host of issues from everything from sustainability to advocacy to the lighter side of life, and would encourage you to tune in and listen and subscribe and do that. As I mentioned, I run a company called Resilient Partners. We're a government and public affairs firm located in the greater Washington, D.C. area. So if any of your listeners ever need assistance or help in that space, feel free to visit us at resilientpartners.us, and you can learn more information about our company and some of the work we do.
Yep. And I could not recommend both the podcast and your work any higher. And I appreciate you being my first guest here on the Redefining Plastics podcast.
Well, I'm honored. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And last thing for those that are listening, we talked a lot about things that are not exactly plastics positive, but we do have a voice. We have the ability to make change, to change the narrative, but we need to be active. We need to get involved. we need to talk about the benefits of plastics. So please, 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 whenever you're talking publicly or even privately, let's talk about the benefits of plastics. And this has been the Redefining Plastics podcast. My name is Justin Riney. Thank you very much for joining.